Okay, thanks for joining me on this ride. Very quickly, Joe Rogan was lied to by Michael Olsterholm on his podcast recently. When Michael Olsterholm stated that we couldn't make this virus, he was flat out lying. And the reason why he was lying is because he is well aware of several studies wherein we used ferrets to enrich for new novel coronaviruses, specifically enriching for respiratory transmitted H5N1 avian flu variants. There are two papers from 2011 which show this, and in a commentary in Science magazine, none other than Michael Olsterholm says that this research is great and that this research is approved by the entire influenza research community. So not only was he aware that we have methodologies that are tried and true at producing gain-of-function research in coronaviruses, but he specifically didn't mention it on Joe Rogan's podcast with the idea of deceiving all of us into thinking that there's no way we could have made this virus. And I assure you, there are plenty of ways we could have made this virus. I'm not telling you we did, I'm not saying I know who did, but I am telling you that everybody who says we couldn't have is lying. And that includes Ralph Barrick, that includes Peter Daszak, and that includes Michael Olsterholm. And anyone else who tells you that we couldn't have made it, you can use these 5 papers to show them. 2000, 2013, 2015, and 2 from 2011. Those 5 papers are enough to solidify any sort of foundation for a review which would say, hey, I think we could have made them. Join me for the ride, read the papers, they're in the links. Let it sink in for a little while, and then don't take any more of these things for granted. This is not a flu variant. Good evening, Pittsburgh and universe. This is J.C. on a bike. My name is J.C. and this is a special report on the coronavirus pandemic 2020, coming at you from lockdown Pittsburgh. I am part of the essential staff at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine research faculty. So I went into work today to take care of animals and other essential duties that are still necessary to happen in the time frame of this pandemic. So my goal with this ride is to specifically express dismay with a guest on the Joe Rogan podcast, a recent guest on the Joe Rogan podcast. His name is Michael Olsterholm, and the long and the short of it is Michael Olsterholm went on Joe Rogan and purposefully deceived us. I'm not going to tell you that he lied, because I don't think that's what these people do. I don't think he lied to us. He just didn't tell us the truth. And here's how that works. Very simply, I want you to listen to the words that he says with regards to whether or not man or a laboratory could have made these viruses, this virus. And I want you to listen to those words very carefully, parse them very carefully. This is semantically important, exactly what he says. Because he says that we could have never come up with this sequence. We would have never predicted this sequence with our computer models and our protein crystallizations. We would have never come up with this model, this sequence. No gene designer would have designed this gene. And he specifically says that there's no way we can make a virus better than nature can. And so clearly this virus was made by nature. That's his argument. That's his main argument why there's no way we could have made this virus. There's no way. Now, first of all, remember that this guy is on the payroll of the NIH and specifically on the payroll of the NIH and the division of the NIH that supports gain-of-function research in viruses. Okay, so you have to get your head around the idea that America has a gain-of-function research labs, and we fund gain-of-function research in viruses. We do. You have to get your head around that, because when you get your head around that, you'll realize why saying that we couldn't have made this virus is just preposterous. It's just a lie. And please don't misunderstand. I'm not claiming I have evidence that we did make it, but I do believe that the status of the scientific literature says that we could have easily made it. And in fact, we have conducted a lot of the research that would be part and parcel what this is. And most of that research has been done in our own American laboratories, or at least funded by our own American money. And the two papers that I want to specifically discuss today were not in my original bibliography, because the guy that I'm working with, the guy from Harvard to the Big House, Dan, he just didn't find that in January yet. He couldn't get all those papers together at once. And so we have been working together. I've been trying to help him as much as I can with my own research, and anything that I find, I'm always forwarding to him. And so his report is evolving and my reports are evolving. But the thing that struck me most about the last week was trying to incorporate these two papers from 2011 into our current sort of narrative. And in this ride, I want to stay away from any speculation. I want to stay away from any, talking about crazy theories. Look, I know that there was a professor that was bought off from Harvard. I know that. Okay? I know that there's reports of him and his lab people. Oh my God, you're an asshole. So, in our original thesis, we started with the 2000 paper in PNAS, where they detailed using cDNA in bacterial genomes to create the RNA of a RNA virus. And they were able to do that, and it was infectious. So that 2000 paper really demonstrates that if we had a sequence, for example, if we had a virus sequence that we wanted to remake, we could do it. We could generate a novel sequence with this procedure. Now, if you just think about this paper alone, Michael Olsterholm's statement is completely true. We would have never come up with this sequence, and nature comes up with much better solutions to these structural problems than computer programs tend to. That's totally true. But interestingly enough, there are two papers from 2011 where they don't use cDNA and bacterial genomes to build novel viruses. What they do is they take the avian H5N1 flu and they pass it through successive infections in a ferret population. And then you say, well, what? Why would they use ferrets? Well, ferrets and cats tend to have a lot of homology with some of our receptor complements, and ferrets have a very high receptor homology with our ACE2 receptors in our lungs. And they're a great model for how flu viruses affect mammals, because the course of the flu infection actually runs very similarly through a ferret as it does through a human. And so what they did with this study, two studies, one from the Netherlands And this is the Erasmus University in the Netherlands. I actually used to work there as a staff scientist for 4 years, so I'm well familiar with their reputation as a viral research hub. And I can remember them talking about having Ebola and other things on the 10th floor. Excuse me. So I knew that they were working on stuff there, but what I didn't know is that in 2011, the NIH funded research at Erasmus and also at the University of Wisconsin simultaneously, where they used a population of ferrets to evolve H5N1. And what happened in both of those studies is the H5N1 virus evolved to be transmissible via the air. And it wasn't transmissible by the air in those animals before these studies. So these were labeled as big time gain of function, right? And when the article in Science comes out, then they always do like a news and views article where they ask other scientists to come and give their opinion about the work. And when this work first came out, there was a lot of people against it. A lot of people against it, saying that there's just no reason to do this because these hypervirulent pathogens don't exist until you make them in a laboratory. So we don't learn very much from them. And interestingly enough, for the Joe Rogan show, Joe Rogan had a guy by the name of Michael Olsterholm on a couple weeks ago to talk about the pandemic and to give us some, real numbers, where he talked about months and months of problems and described a sort of worst case scenario that seems to be coming true so far. But more importantly to this discussion, he came on and in the first 10 minutes, in the very first 10 minutes, he explained why the odds of us creating this in a laboratory, or the odds of it coming from a laboratory, were nil. 0. And the reason why, he claimed, was because the sequence that is in this spike protein, which shows a great homology for the ACE2 receptor in humans, is a structural homology that would not have been predicted by computer models, and therefore no one would have ever chosen this sequence to create the virus. So first of all, parse that statement out and realize that he's telling you that if they had this sequence already, they could make it. He's telling you that they can make viruses, it's just that we would never have chosen this sequence. So first of all, he's not denying that we could have made it, he's just saying that the sequence is so special that we would have never made it. That's very different than saying we couldn't have made it. And that's where these two H5N1 papers come in, because in 2011, when these papers came out, they solicited opinions from a wide variety of experts in the field, including one Michael Olsterholm. Michael Olsterholm can be quoted in this News and Views Science article talking about scientists preparing for the backlash against gain-of-function research. So while the guy who was funded by the NIH and working in the Netherlands, while that guy was trying to get his study approved for publication, this article came out and said that there was going to be a lot of outcry and protest against this paper, these two papers. And so this cover article comes out, and they want experts to speak. And so one of the guys they get is from the University of Minnesota, and his name is Michael Olsterholm. So he's commenting on these two papers, where they take H5N1, which is a coronavirus, and they pass it through ferrets, and it took about 10 generations for it to become an airborne pathogen. The author of that paper can be quoted as saying that this is the nastiest virus you could ever make. And there are other scientists in that opinion article saying that there's no reason to do this. The research should have never been done. Michael Olsterholm The guy who went on Joe Rogan and said there's no way we could have done it because we wouldn't have come up with the sequence. You see the lie? We didn't need to come up with the sequence. We have tried and true methods of using other hosts and large populations of other hosts to allow the normal mutation rate and recombination rate of viruses to do all the work for us. And he completely and totally glosses over this without mentioning it at all. And in fact, what I find most compelling is that a very recent Nature Medicine paper came out called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2. And they present about 3 different scenarios of how this virus could have been brought into being. And 2 of those scenarios are a virus in the laboratory. 2 of them. Now, they use a bunch of fancy language to tell you why those 2 laboratory methods would be not working. But the papers that they cite are not these. They don't cite the 2 most relevant papers. They don't cite the chimeric paper from 2015 that Ralph Barrick is on. The guy who came out and told us that we shouldn't really worry about this. It's just like a flu. Peter Daszak is also on a 2013 paper with Sheng-Li Shi. Sheng-Li Shi is the author that's now at Wuhan and that everybody has been touting on social media as a hero because she's been collecting these viruses in the wild. So everybody associated with this research, everyone, is coming online and either being touted as a hero or very specifically coming online to say that we could have never made it. And they're all giving the same stupid explanation, which is we would have never come up with this sequence. And that is a complete bullshit line. It makes no sense at all. Because already in 2011 there are literally multiple papers showing that we don't need the sequence. That because of the way viruses assemble inside of cells, viral parts get recombined, viral proteins get recombined, and viral genes get recombined. That just by passing the virus through successive generations in a host, the virus will evolve to better infect that host. And so if you choose a host with similar homology, a receptor homology to us, like a ferret, then the virus that results is likely to also affect humans. Done! And so in my mind, the bibliography gets pretty short now. And if you want to ask these people about anything, we're going to ask them about 4 or 5 papers. That's it. We don't need to say anything else. Okay, so real quick. Michael Olsterholm probably deceived Joe Rogan on his podcast. Specifically, he said that there's no way that we could have selected this sequence and made this virus. It's just not predictable by our computer models and wouldn't have been predicted by any gene jockey that would select a sequence and try to build a novel spike protein, him or herself. The trick with this statement is that that's not even required, and that Michael Olsterholm knows that that's not required. So by him making that statement, he is trying to deceive us through Joe Rogan. Because if he was to state freely what he knows and freely what he thinks, then what he would say is that we have used populations of ferrets to enrich H5N1, and that resulted in a very big gain of function where 5 separate sort of features of the H5N1 on different viruses were brought together on one single virus in that paper. And it was only done by using this population of ferrets in about 10 successive generations of the virus. So that's pretty spectacular, because what we have here, there's a red-tailed hawk right over my head, that's why I'm looking up. What we have here then is an expert who gets paid by the NIH. The NIH funded all of this research, both at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2011 and also at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, where I actually used to work between 2012 and 2016. So I was familiar with the intense amount of research that occurs there, and they had a reputation for the 10th floor being the virus floor. So interestingly enough, about a year and a half before I started working at that university was when these 2 papers were published, and they were published under a lot of duress, because a lot of the general field was saying that this research is not only not necessary and didn't really give us much new information, but really created a gigantic risk. And so again, this guy, Michael Olsterholm, went on Joe Rogan's podcast knowing all this stuff, having commented in Science magazine about the usefulness and the powerfulness of this research, and didn't mention a word of it to Joe Rogan, and specifically said, we couldn't have come up with the sequence. Nature is much better at us for designing things. But he didn't mention that we know how to use nature to design things. He didn't mention that we've already perfected the technique to harness nature to design viruses. And that's where he deceived Joe Rogan. If you liked it, like and subscribe. I'll see you next time on JC on a Bike.